Picture the late 1480s, the sun rising over Mbanza, Congo, the royal city. The red earth is damp from morning rain, and as the mist lifts, the whole valley begins to stir. Smoke curls into the sky from hundreds of hearths. Hearth means the open space where the fire is built, the center of each family's cooking and warmth. These weren't scattered huts, but fires bound together in the rhythm of a city. The air is thick with smells: cassava roasting, fish drying in the sun, palm oil simmering in clay pots. You can hear goats roaming, children shouting, drums thundering in practiced rhythms that tell messages from one hill to the next. In the courtyards, women pound grain with tall wooden pestles, the steady thump carrying like a heartbeat through the city. Above all this rises the compound of the Manikongo, the king. His court is not a simple hut, but a seat of power: wide courtyards, carved posts, warriors at the gates, nobles filing in with tribute from the provinces. Soyo by the coast, Mbamba with its armies, and Sundi with its fertile lands. Early Portuguese who would soon stumble in compared the size of this capital to Evora in their own homeland. For them it was shock. For the Congo people, it was normal life. But there's an essence here deeper than the sights and sounds. It is the confidence of a kingdom that knows itself. The people move with belonging, their rituals old, their faith in their ancestors strong. Before foreign sails pierced the horizon, the Congo was already a world of order, spirit, and wealth. While the Kingdom of Kongo thrived in its forests and valleys, across the savannas to the north and east, another rhythm was pulsing: Islamic trade, scholarship, and empire. Farther inland, in the bend of the Niger River, the Songhai Empire had risen after Mali's decline. In cities like Timbuktu and Gao, the call to prayer echoed above the bustle of markets. The smell of ink and parchment filled the air in madrasas, where scholars copied Qur'ans and wrote treatises on astronomy, law, and medicine. Merchants led camel caravans across the Sahara, their bells jingling, their packs heavy with salt, gold, and manuscripts. To them, Islam wasn't just a religion, it was the language of law, education, and prestige. To the east, along the Swahili coast, towns like Kilwa and Mombasa were already glittering with mosques facing the ocean. The monsoon winds carried the scent of spices, ivory, and cloth as Arab and Persian traders docked their dhows. The rhythmic recitation of Qur'an wove into the creak of ships and the bargaining of sailors. Here, Islam flowed in through the sea, stitching East Africa into a global world of Arabia, India, and beyond. Even closer to Congo, Islamic whispers rode the trade routes. House estates in today's northern Nigeria had embraced Islam centuries earlier, and Muslim clerics journeyed through forests and savannas with their teachings. Though Congo itself remained rooted in its ancestral beliefs, stories of a God worshipped through scripture and prayer may have reached their ears. Enough that Garrido's people would later understand the strangeness when Catholic priests came bearing crosses. This would have been the era his parents grew up in. Congo alive with its own order and spirit, while to the north and east Islamic courts and cities flourished. Two great worlds standing side by side on the eve of Europe's deeper intrusion. First Portuguese contact came in 1483, 4 years before Juan Garrido's birth. Along the banks of the great Nzadi, Congo River, the people of Congo watched sails rise like giant white wings against the horizon. These were not birds, but caravels, Portuguese ships, their wooden hulls creaking, their sails swollen with Atlantic winds. The smell of salt and tar reached the shore before the men did. When Diogo Cao and his crew stepped onto African soil, they carried polished iron tools, scarlet cloth, and crosses of wood and metal. To the Manikongo's envoys, They spoke in honeyed tones, promises of friendship, alliance, and shared faith under one God. They claimed their distant king desired only peace and trade. But woven into these words was trickery. They seized young envoys and carried them away for learning, saying they would return wiser. Some never came back. They offered tools and trinkets, yet their eyes searched for power and souls to claim. Imagine Garrido's parents as children in this moment, elders drumming warnings through the valleys, whispers spreading that the strangers came with both gifts and hidden chains. Curiosity hung in the air, but so did unease. And yet, none of this unfolded by accident. Allah had written the stage long before a sail touched the horizon. The Congo kingdom's strength, the stranger's arrival, the hidden betrayal, all of it was part of a decree larger than any king or conqueror could control. The hearts that beat with fear and wonder that day were already moving within his plan, preparing the ground for a child who would one day carry Africa's story across the ocean. By 1491, Juan Garrido was a small child. The Portuguese had returned, not just with traders, but with priests, masons, and soldiers. They came carrying books in a language no one in Congo could yet read, carved crucifixes, and songs in Latin that sounded like chants from another world. In Mbanza, Congo, the royal court filled with new sights and smells, smoke from traditional hearths, the open fires where families cooked and gathered, mingled with the heavy fragrance of incense burning in church ceremonies. The pounding of drums in the courtyards was joined by the chiming of small handbells the priests carried. Villagers pressed in to watch as Manikongo and Zinga, Ankuwu, and nobles were baptized, taking new names like Juan I. The water poured over their heads was said to cleanse them into a new faith, yet to many, it looked like an invasion disguised as purity. The king himself felt the tension. One day drawn to the foreign god, the next day pulled back to the ways of his ancestors, he wavered. Around him, nobles debated fiercely. Some saw opportunity in alliance with Portugal. Others warned that what looked like friendship might end in chains. For Garrido's parents' generation, this was bewildering. Imagine standing in that courtyard, hearing Latin prayers rise, words you did not know, while the smell of palm wine still clung to your clothes, and the ancestral spirits were still whispered to in the night. It was not only a change of religion being forced upon them, it was a clash of worlds. And yet, Allah had written this too. The Quran says, "They plan, and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners." Quran 8:30. Even as Portugal sought to claim souls for itself, what truly unfolded was what Allah allowed. The seeds of conquest, conversion, and resistance were planted side by side. Garrido would grow up walking among those seeds, carrying both the memory of his ancestors and the touch of a new religion into the world he would one day cross. In the 1490s, when Garrido was still a child, Mbanza, Congo stood proud on its hilltop, a true city in a land where outsiders assumed only villages could exist. Travelers who later came compared its size to Évora in Portugal, but for its people, it was already the heart of a kingdom. The streets bustled with traders bringing cloth, ivory, salt, and copper from the provinces. You could smell smoked fish laid out on mats, hear the hawking voices of merchants, and see lines of porters carrying bundles on their backs. Nobles strode in with tribute, their guards behind them, while children ran through the alleys laughing, their feet kicking up red dust. At the center rose the royal compound, alive with ceremony, horns blasting at dawn, warriors training with spears, envoys rushing in and out with news from the provinces of Soyo, Mbamba, and Sundi. Drums never truly went silent. They carried messages across hills, linking villages to the capital like threads of sound. To the people, this was not just a city, it was proof of order, proof of greatness. The capital was a reflection of the kingdom's strength, a place where the ancestors' spirits and the Manikongo's authority met. And yet, on its edges, foreign ideas were creeping in. New prayers, new tools, new whispers of power. Still, none of this was chaos. Allah had already written that this city would stand as a stage for history. Mbanza Kongo was more than stone and clay. It was a vessel for what was coming. The Quran says, "And you do not will except that Allah wills." Quran 76:30. Every path through its streets, every sound of drum and prayer was moving under that greater will, shaping the ground for Garrido's life and the journeys that would carry him far from home. Garrido was no longer a child in Mbanza Kongo. The Portuguese had carved a steady channel between Lisbon and the Congo River, and African youths were often taken. Some as envoys, some as captives, some chasing promises of opportunity. Garrido was among them. He crossed the Atlantic waters northward, his first voyage not toward the Caribbean, but toward Portugal itself. Lisbon in that era was alive with noise, the shouts of fishmongers, the hammering of shipwrights, the smell of salt cod and tanned leather. Garrido stepped into a port city buzzing with merchants from Flanders, Morocco, and Italy. For the first time, he heard church bells toll from towering cathedrals and saw cobblestone streets lined with houses of stone, unlike the red earth compounds of Congo. In Portugal, he adopted the name Juan Garrido, Juan from Spanish baptism, Garrido meaning handsome or elegant. This was not the name his ancestors had whispered over him at birth, but the name the New World required him to wear. Some records suggest he was enslaved and then freed. Others say he may have arrived as a servant envoy. Either way, he was swept into Europe's tide. It was here that Garrido's life split into two worlds, Africa in his blood, Europe on his tongue. He would soon move again, from Lisbon to Seville, Spain, where fleets bound for the Caribbean gathered. And through it all, we remember, Allah had already written this journey. The Quran says, "It is He who makes you travel on land and sea." Quran 10:22. Garrido's feet, though pulled by empire's tides, walked the path Allah had measured, a path that would carry him further than he could yet imagine. By the early 1500s, Juan Garrido had crossed into the next world of empire, the Caribbean islands. From Seville, he sailed with fleets bound for Hispaniola, joining the tide of soldiers, settlers, and fortune seekers who followed Spain's flag across the Atlantic. When he stepped onto Hispaniola, the air was thick with the smell of sugarcane fields and the sweat of labor. Spanish towns like Santo Domingo were taking shape, wooden houses with clay roofs, Catholic churches rising, streets noisy with merchants and enslaved Taíno people forced to carry burdens not their own. Garrido, as a free black man, walked a fragile line. He fought as a conquistador under Spanish captains, yet he lived among people enslaved by the same empire he served. From Hispaniola, he joined expeditions to Puerto Rico with Juan Ponce de Leon. Imagine him in the humid forests, hearing parrots shriek above the canopy, cutting through vines with steel. He was part of founding Capara, one of the first Spanish towns on the island. Later, he fought in Cuba under Diego Velázquez, where drums of the Taíno mixed with the clash of steel and the gunpowder smoke of Spanish muskets. To stand there, as Garrido did, was to feel both belonging and displacement. He had left the red soil of Congo, walked the stone streets of Lisbon and Seville, and now stood in the lush green of the Caribbean. Part of Spain's armies, yet forever marked by the skin and ancestry they saw as other. But even here, far from Africa, he was not outside the plan of Allah. The Quran says, "And to Allah belongs the east and the west." So wherever you might turn, there is the face of Allah. Quran 2115. Garrido's sword, his footsteps, his breaths in the tropical night, all moved on a path that had been decreed, even as he searched for his place in this new world. In 1513, Juan Garrido stood on the deck of a ship sailing north from Puerto Rico with Juan Ponce de Leon. The sea wind was sharp, carrying the smell of salt and pitch from the ropes. Ahead lay a land the Spanish would call La Florida, because they reached it during Easter season, Pascua Florida, the Feast of Flowers. When Garrido stepped ashore, the humid air pressed heavy on his skin. Palmettos rustled in the breeze, and wildflowers painted the ground with bright colors. He became one of the first recorded Africans to set foot on the soil of what would later be called the United States. But beauty did not mean peace. The expedition met resistance from native peoples defending their homelands. Spears whistled, arrows darkened the sky, and Spanish steel struck back with violence. The sounds of battle echoed through pine forests, mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. Garrido fought in these skirmishes, not as a slave but as a soldier, a paradox of freedom bought through service to an empire that enslaved others. To Garrido's eyes, this land was unlike Africa or the Caribbean, wide rivers glistening, forests alive with unknown birds, marshes heavy with insects. He was a stranger, yet once again he carried Africa's presence into a place that had never seen it before. When Hernán Cortés set sail for Mexico in 1519, Juan Garrido was with him. The ships cut across the Gulf of Mexico at dawn, and each wave that lifted their hulls rose only because Allah commanded the sea to rise and fall. Garrido stood on the deck, the salt air in his lungs, breath that Allah had still written for him to take, carrying him deeper into the story of history. On the shores of Veracruz, the humid air pressed heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and strange flowers. Garrido's boots sank into a land he had never seen before. Around him, soldiers crossed themselves nervously, while native messengers blew conch shells in the distance. Allah had gathered three worlds here: Africa through Garrido, Europe through Spain, and the Americas through the Mexica, not by accident, but as part of his will unfolding. As the march toward Tenochtitlan began, Garrido's sword arm grew weary, but each step he took on the long road was a step Allah allowed him. Volcanoes towered in the distance, their peaks capped with snow, reminding every man that creation was greater than empire. Nights by the campfires were filled with hunger, arguments, and prayers, Spanish soldiers muttering Catholic litanies, Garrido remembering the spirits of his ancestors, and over all of them, Allah's knowledge watching as they stumbled forward. When the siege of Tenochtitlan finally came, chaos filled the air. Smoke from burning temples rose like black columns, and the stench of death clung to the canals. Garrido, with other Africans and Spaniards, fought in streets slick with blood. He later claimed to have built a small chapel to bury the Spanish dead, but in truth, only Allah received those souls, weighing them with perfect justice. Through hunger, war, and exhaustion, Garrido survived, not because Spain protected him, not because of his sword, but because Allah sustained his life for more to be written. The Quran says, "And it is He who gives life and causes death, and to Him belongs the alternation of the night and the day." Quran 23:80. The night fell on Tenochtitlan by his command, and the dawn rose again so that Garrido could open his eyes to another trial. When the dust of war settled over Tenochtitlan, Juan Garrido did not vanish into the shadows of history. He stayed. Out of the rubble of temples and canals, the Spanish began to build Mexico City. Every brick lifted, every stone dragged into place, was moved only because Allah allowed hands the strength to lift them. Garrido was among those hands, carving a place for himself in a city that was becoming the heart of Spain's empire in the New World. He married, raised 3 children, and lived in a modest house near the bustle of the market. Imagine him waking at dawn to the sound of roosters, the smell of tortillas on clay griddles, the streets alive with both Spaniards and Nahua people rebuilding their lives. And still, as his eyes opened each morning, it was Allah who returned his soul from sleep, giving him another chance to walk the path written for him. Garrido also claimed something remarkable. He said he was the first to plant wheat in New Spain. He described how he took a handful of grains, pressed them into the soil, and waited. Days stretched into weeks, and then green shoots broke through the dirt. To others, it was farming. To Garrido, it was a sign. Bread would now rise in this land because Allah had permitted a seed to split and grow. Have you seen that which you sow? Is it you who makes it grow, or are we the grower? Quran 56:63-64. In time, he also served the city in humble roles, as a doorkeeper of the council, as a guard for the great stone water channel that brought fresh water into Mexico City, and as the man who walked the streets calling out news and announcements to the people. It was not glory, but it was survival. And every message he shouted, every drop of water that flowed through the channel, moved under the watch of Allah, who had decreed Garrido's journey from Congo's red earth to Mexico's stone streets. Though his petitions for royal reward were often ignored, though his service brought him little wealth, Garrido's life itself was proof of Allah's plan. A boy born in Africa, carried across seas, had become a man rooted in the center of a new empire, not by Spain's will, but by the hand of the one who writes every story. As the years passed, Garrido's hair turned gray, and the strength in his arms began to fade. Yet every morning he still rose, because Allah gave him back his breath after sleep, another chance to walk in the world before returning to him. He continued to live in Mexico City, surrounded by the noise of markets and church bells, the smell of tortillas and burning wood drifting through narrow streets. His children grew, and his voice, once strong in battle, became the voice of a father, guiding them through a life caught between Africa's memory and Spain's empire. But age did not bring him wealth. Garrido petitioned the Spanish crown for reward after decades of service, reminding them of his battles, his planting of wheat, his years as a loyal soldier and servant. Yet most of those requests went unanswered. In the eyes of empire, he was useful, but not valuable. Still, Allah had honored him with survival, with family, with a name that carried across history. Sometime in the 1540s or early 1550s, his time ended. His body, once carried across oceans, now rested in Mexico's soil. And just as his first breath in Congo was given by Allah, so too was his last breath taken by Allah, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to beg from kings. His story reminds us, no man, not even a king or conqueror, writes history. Allah alone writes it. Juan Garrido, the African child who left Congo, the soldier who crossed oceans, the planter of wheat, lived and died as part of that divine script. Every soul shall taste death. Then to us will you be returned. Quran 29:57. Before you go, here is what I learned as I did research. 1. On empathy in the sources. When you read the Spanish and European chroniclers, you realize something very quickly. they never cared about Juan Garrido's feelings. To them, he was just a note in the margins, a curiosity, a black man who fought with Spaniards, who planted wheat. That was it. They didn't stop to ask how he felt, what it meant for him to leave his homeland, or what it did to his heart to see other Africans enslaved while he stood free. The tone of their writing is cold, like homework, facts stacked one after the other, no soul inside. They never imagined his sleepless nights, switching languages between Congo, Portuguese, Spanish. They didn't picture the weight he must have carried, knowing his survival depended on serving the very empire that enslaved others. They never asked what it meant to him to walk into a chapel he helped build, burying bodies, while wondering if God saw his struggle. That lack of empathy is loud. It's why, when I read their words today, I feel like I'm looking through glass. They recorded him, but they didn't see him. And so it's on us now to give back the humanity they stripped away, to tell his story with the feeling they refused to recognize. 2. On numbness and spiritual sleep. Sometimes a person cries out to Allah, and when the relief doesn't come right away, the heart starts to grow numb. The Quran itself says hearts can become hard like stone, 274. That doesn't mean Allah abandons us. It means the dunya's weight can press so heavy that remembrance gets dim. I think Garrido may have fallen into that kind of sleep. He survived, but maybe he stopped asking why. Maybe numbness made him accept roles his awakened soul would have resisted. That doesn't excuse him, but it explains the silence in his story. 3. On irony and divine preservation. The irony is heavy. The same system that used Garrido, erased his voice, and stripped him of choice is the very system that preserved his name. He begged Spain for recognition, for bread to feed his family, and those petitions, written in desperation, became the paper that carried him through time. From an Islamic lens, this is not accident, but decree. And Allah will perfect his light, though the disbelievers dislike it. 61:8. Spain thought they were recording an obedient servant. Instead, they were becoming scribes of Allah's plan, leaving behind evidence of a black man's survival, so centuries later, his people would remember him. Even if Garrido lived in a kind of sleep, worn numb by conquest and compromise, Allah still preserved him. His name didn't vanish into the soil, like so many who were silenced. His footsteps remain on record, not because Spain valued him, but because Allah willed that his story would outlive empire. To me, that is mercy. It's Allah saying, you weren't forgotten. Your struggle, even broken, even compromised, was seen. 4. On being made master after being mastered. This part is almost unbearable to think about. Garrido may have known enslavement as a youth, yet later he fought as a soldier over indigenous peoples, standing on the side of conquest. To the surface reader, it looks like hypocrisy. A man once chained, now wielding the chain. But if we sit with it, if we read with empathy, it feels more like survival inside a distorted script. He didn't write the story he was forced to live in. He tried to breathe inside it. And Allah, by allowing his contradictions to be recorded, shows us something bigger, the cycle of oppression, how trauma reproduces itself, how victims can be folded into empire and made tools of the same machine that broke them. That's why mercy matters. Without Allah's mercy interrupting, the cycle continues. Pain passed from one people to another, each trying to survive the only way they know. Garrido's life is not only a record of conquest, it's a mirror of what happens when survival gets twisted into service. And even then, Allah preserved his story so we could see the cycle and seek something higher.